Well, welcome, family, to our 10-minute table talk. I am Pastor Holman. Thank you so very much for joining us here on the set today. Brand new year, 2022, and we are thankful for God's grace and his mercy. In Luke chapter number 5, beginning at verse number 12, I want to read to you a few words. And it says this: as it happened when he entered into a certain city, that behold, a man who was full of leprosy saw Jesus, and he fell down on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Then he put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately the leprosy left him. And he charged him to tell no one, saying, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing as a testimony to them, just as Moses commanded. However, the report went out around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. For a couple of minutes, I want to talk to you from the subject of I am willing. Background would do us well to understand in this particular text is that Jesus now is in the city of Capernaum, which is Peter's hometown. It is a fishing city, but there are many different ports gathered along the Sea of Galilee. And as Jesus comes into the city, he is encountered by this man with leprosy. Let me tell you a little bit about leprosy. It was the worst of all diseases that anyone could ever have. Leprosy was akin to a death sentence. If you had leprosy, you were shunned by the community. As a matter of fact, they set up these things called leprosy camps, and they would snatch you out of your home if you were afflicted with this horrible disease and put you in a community of people that had the same affliction as you. You had no visitors. As a matter of fact, as they would come down the road, they would throw food into the city of these people that were afflicted by leprosy. They were absolutely excommunicated from any and all of their relations. It was a horrible disease. Leprosy affected the skin, which caused it to turn white and very coarse. And so somebody that had leprosy would actually lose the feelings of their hands. They would lose the sense of touch. Oftentimes, their noses would fall off. Their ears would crumble because it would cause their skin to be very, very coarse. Leprosy was a very contagious disease. This is why they set up the leprosy camps, because if the lepers were around anybody else, they would get everybody else what they had. It was a very contagious disease. And imagine being that person that came home and having to share with your family that you've been just diagnosed with leprosy. Immediately, they would send you out of the house. Immediately, in our times, what they would call it is quarantine you, but not quarantine you for 5 or 7 days, but quarantine you until the day that you died, because there was no cure for leprosy. And here it is, this man has leprosy, comes up to Jesus. He sees Jesus from afar, has heard the reports about this man, Jesus, and he makes his way to Jesus. Watch this, at the cost of his life, because he's leaving the camp of lepers in order to make his way to Jesus. And if he leaves the camp of the lepers, there's a high probability that if anybody, a Roman soldier or anybody of the such, could kill him if he is outside of the camp. But he sees Jesus and he makes his way toward him. And I want you to hear what he says when he gets to Jesus. These words are very, very specific. In verse number 12, he fell on his face and he implored Jesus. He said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Listen to that desperate plea. I relate this a whole lot to what's going on in our current environment right now, even in 2022. where COVID has dominated the landscape of our lives for the last 2 years. And whether you want to admit it or not, we treat those who have COVID in the same manner that we treat this leper. Stay away from me, get away from me, because what you have is extremely contagious and you need to be quarantined away from everybody else. I relate that a lot to what we're going to right now in 2020, 2022, because what you don't know about this city of lepers is that most of them suffered with depression, isolation, and loneliness. A recent report came out right now with the CDC talking about school-aged children where suicides have gone up 51% in the last 2 years. That children now are feeling isolated and lonely and depressed because they are away from their contemporaries. Here it is, this man comes to Jesus with a very contagious disease, falls down and saying, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And listen to the words of Jesus in verse number 13. This will shock you when you understand it in its totality. Then Jesus put out his hand and watch these words, touched him. Jesus is a rabbi. He is a priest. There's no way in the world that a priest, a rabbi, would ever touch a person with leprosy. He was unclean, unless Jesus himself would be made unclean. But Jesus went far beyond the condition of the man, the physical condition of the man, and looked at the emotional condition of the man. Because in verse number 12, the Bible says that he fell down on his face and he implored him. He drenched himself in tears. With nothing else to lose, he gave it all to Christ. And Christ looked past the leprosy and saw the man's emotional need and touched him. What a word. He touched this man. Even in the middle while everybody else was looking, Jesus stretched out his hands and touched him. And watch what the Bible says. Immediately, the leprosy left. Not only was this man cured physically, that is just a side effect. He's still going to die. He might not die from leprosy. He might die from old age, but he's still going to die. The leprosy was contained. It was removed, but that's not the gist of the miracle. The miracle is that Jesus restored this man, because now this man does not have to go back to the leprosy camp. Now this man does not have to live in isolation. Now this man can get back to his normal routine. He no longer has to be depressed. God has not only healed him of his physical ailment, but he has released him spiritually and emotionally. And watch these words. And he charged him, go show yourself to the priest. Why is that important? Because watch this. The priest, the temple, would not allow lepers in. The spiritual house of God would not allow those who were afflicted with diseases to come anywhere near the temple. Those who were in isolated parts for years upon years, most of which would die alone and by themselves, were not only not allowed to come into the temple, but not even to enter into the courtyard. Jesus says specifically, go to the court, go to the priest who are in the temple and show yourself. It's so important, everybody, because right now it burns my heart to what's going on in our nation. It burns my heart to see that we're isolating and dejecting people. Well, those of us who have the Spirit of God, not that we need to be willy-nilly in all of our physical affairs, but we must express the heart of Jesus with those who are going through ailments of many kinds. And now what we're doing is the same thing that they were doing in Jesus' time. They're not leper camps, they're COVID-19 camps. And if you got COVID-19, then you got the willy-nillys. I don't mean to make light of that, but what Jesus does here is so important for us today. This is important because what he says here at the end was that the report about him went around all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear him and be healed of their infirmities, not just leprosy. But see, people, the man with the withered hand, the person that was born blind, the person that was born deaf, the person that was born a paraplegic, heard about what Jesus did to the man that had leprosy, and they made their way to Christ so that Christ could heal them of their infirmities. So I want you to think about this. The people in verse 15 would have never gotten healed if Jesus hadn't done verse 13. If Jesus had not stretched out his hand and touched the man, he could have spoke. Y'all know that Jesus could have spoke and leprosy would have left. Jesus had no need to touch this man with leprosy. He could have spoke and said, leprosy be gone, and leprosy would have jumped off of this man's body and left. But Jesus touched him in verse 13. And when he touched this man, I can just see it in my mind's eye. This man was filled with so much empathy because for years of his life, nobody had ever touched him because he was unclean. If Jesus had not done verse 13, the man in verse number 14 could have never been back to the temple to show himself to the priest. If he would have never showed himself to the priest, the people in verse number 15 would have never saw the miracle and then thus come to Jesus, lest their infirmities would be healed. All of this started with Jesus touching this man. And there must be a time in our lives where empathy and compassion must lead us. I understand this is a very difficult time that we're in. But saints, we need the compassion of God. Because just as Jesus said to this man with leprosy, I am willing, so he says to us today, I am willing. God bless you. God keep you. Until next week, we'll see you then.